Syria's civil war is expanding. Good evening. I'm Mark Martin. When the Syrian uprising turned into a civil war in 2011, most of the trouble stayed inside Syria's borders. But that's changing. The conflict has now spread beyond the borders into Turkey, Lebanon, and Israel. Chris Mitchell has tonight's top story from Jerusalem.
This week, more than 3 years after Syria's civil war broke out, armored personnel carriers rushed to prevent fighting between supporters and opponents of Syrian President Bashar Assad. But not in Syria, in Beirut, Lebanon, a sign the war has spread well beyond Syria's borders. Here's another sign. Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan at an election rally last Sunday. He's praising the Turkish Air Force for shooting down a Syrian plane after it violated Turkey's airspace.
If you violate our border, our slap will be hard. Therefore, I congratulate first our Chief of General Staff and our pilots.
Also last week, Israeli warplanes struck Syrian military posts in the Golan Heights after a roadside bombing wounded 4 Israeli soldiers. It was some of the worst fighting on Israel's border with Syria in decades. Israel doesn't want a war with Syria, and the Netanyahu government has tried to steer clear of the conflict between Assad and his opposition. But the conflict is expanding anyway.
I think we can already consider now that the Israel-Syria border is back, is a conflict border once again. And what we're going to see, I think, as in common with Israel's other conflict borders, for example, vis-a-vis the Hamas statelet in Gaza, is that we will have periodic rounds of violence in which the Hezbollah or the Assad regime or whoever it is, or perhaps in other sectors of the border, the Sunni jihadis on the rebel side, will try to redress the balance against Israel.
Muslim rebel groups, some backed by al-Qaeda, are gaining ground near the Turkish border. Here they enter a deserted Armenian Christian town. They shout victory from Allah. We shall soon conquer. A short time later, they gained their first foothold on the shores of the Mediterranean. Israel has been treating Syrians injured in fighting. In February, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited a field hospital and met with some of the Syrian wounded. He also pointed to Iran as Assad's chief sponsor in the widening war.
Who's supplying these bombs? Who's supplying these weapons? Iran. Who's giving the instructions? Iran. Who's giving the backing for this butchery? Iran. That's the bad. Here's the good. It's right near.
Middle East analyst Jonathan Spire warns an Assad victory in Syria is a victory for Iran.
This would be an immense victory for the Iranians and therefore an immense defeat for the US interest, which sees, or at least ought to see, I'm not quite sure if the US does right now see it this way, but ought to see the Iran-led regional bloc as the most potent and powerful challenge to Western interest and Western allies in the Middle East.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And as the Syrian civil war spills over, the United States is warning extremists are using the region to set up terrorism training grounds. The director of the CIA says al-Qaeda is trying to recruit those fighting in Syria, but not just for attacks in that country. Director John Brennan recently told a House panel he believes Syria is only a launching pad and that those trained there could eventually attempt to attack America.